Some people follow trends, others set them, but a few, a very rare few, invent entire worlds for the rest of us to live in. This is the story of a boy who stared at circuits the way others stare at stars. A barefoot rebel, too intense for school, too bold for business as usual. He didn't want a job. He wanted to reshape reality. From garage whispers to keynote thunder, his voice turned silicon into religion. He wasn't just creating products. He was crafting emotion in aluminum. But genius comes with a price. And this story, well, it's not just about glory. It's about rage, ego, betrayal, obsession. This is not a tribute. It's a dissection. This is the life of the man who made you touch glass and call it magic. Chapter 1. Childhood of a Rebel. Steve Jobs was born in San Francisco on February 24, 1955. But from the moment he opened his eyes, the world had already taken a different path for him. His biological parents, a Syrian political science professor and an American speech therapist, gave him up for adoption. The baby would end up in the arms of Paul and Clara Jobs, a working-class couple in Mountain View, California. No tech empires, no millions, just a humble home, a garage, and a boy who would grow up thinking he was special, not because someone told him, but because he felt it in his bones. His father, Paul, wasn't an engineer, but he was a craftsman. He showed Steve how to take apart radios and put them back together. This wasn't just play. It was surgery, precision, perfection. If a screw was out of place, it meant something was wrong. Steve absorbed it, not just the skills, but the obsession for detail. He learned early that if something was going to exist in the world, it should be beautifully made, even if no one would ever see the inside. School, however, was a problem. Steve was brilliant, but bored. Authority irritated him. Teachers felt like obstacles, not mentors. He pulled pranks, questioned everything, challenged every rule. Once, he wired a classroom with a homemade electric current to shock his classmates. Because he could. Because he wanted to see what would happen. He was that kind of kid, curious to the point of combustion. In the 4th grade, his teacher bribed him to learn. She offered candy bars if he did his homework. It worked a little too well. Steve scored so high on his test that the school recommended skipping 2 grades. His parents said no. He was already a loner. Throwing him into a group of older kids would have been like tossing a match into gasoline. And then came the neighborhood. Silicon Valley before it was Silicon Valley. Just a bunch of orchards and new subdivisions full of engineers. Steve met kids whose parents worked at Hewlett-Packard. That company would unknowingly shape the next decade of his life. By the time he hit high school, Steve was already into Zen Buddhism, psychedelics, and hacking telephone systems. Yes, hacking phones. He built blue boxes with his friend Steve Wozniak to make free long-distance calls because it felt like magic, not the illegal part. The power of creating something out of nothing and bending the system to your will. He once said, "Without the blue boxes, there would have been no Apple." These weren't just misfit moments. They were early signals, a rebellious mind, a hunger for control, and an unshakable belief that the rules weren't made for him. This was not a normal boy. This was a signal flare, a message from the future, disguised as a teenager in a turtleneck and jeans. Chapter 2. Dropout by Design. College was supposed to be the next logical step. In 1972, Steve Jobs enrolled at Reed College, an expensive liberal arts school in Portland, Oregon. His parents had spent most of their savings just to get him in. But within 6 months, he dropped out. On paper, a disaster. But in Steve's mind, it was a necessary revolution. He didn't quit because he was lazy. He quit because he felt constrained. The required classes bored him. The debt horrified him. The system felt like a cage for creativity. By dropping out, he was finally free to learn what he wanted. And he did. He stayed on campus, slept on floors, returned Coke bottles for food money, and crashed in friends' dorms. Every meal was a favor. Every night, an improvisation. But this was also when his mind stretched in unpredictable ways. He audited classes that fascinated him: calligraphy, Eastern philosophy, art. It was in a typography class that he fell in love with the form and function of letters. He learned about serif and sans serif fonts, about spacing and harmony. Years later, this knowledge would explode into Apple's design philosophy. As he said in a speech, If I had never dropped in on that single calligraphy course in college, the Mac would have never had multiple typefaces or proportionally spaced fonts. It was the start of something profound, the merging of technology and art. Jobs also began immersing himself deeper into counterculture. He read Autobiography of a Yogi. He experimented with LSD. He practiced meditation. He walked barefoot. He grew distant from traditional ambitions. But there was a strange kind of order in his chaos, a gravitational pull toward meaning, toward something bigger than success. He wasn't just trying to make things, he was trying to understand why they should exist. In this period, he took a trip to India in search of spiritual clarity. He shaved his head, wore robes, got sick, came back thinner, quieter, and more intense. Enlightenment didn't arrive in a flash of light, it arrived in fragments. But it embedded a relentless curiosity in him, a hunger not just for answers, but for the right questions. To most people, he looked like a lost young man. But beneath the beard and silence was a mind assembling the blueprint of a new world. It just didn't look like a business plan. It looked like a revolution waiting for its moment. Bonus 1. Zen and the Art of Obsession. Before Steve Jobs became the face of innovation, he was a barefoot seeker wandering through spiritual chaos. This was a version of Steve far from corporate boardrooms and keynote stages, a young man obsessed not with profit, but with purity. After dropping out of Reed College, Steve didn't just sit around. He slept on floors in friends' dorm rooms, returned Coke bottles for spare change, and walked 7 miles each Sunday to get a free meal at the Hare Krishna temple. But none of that felt beneath him. On the contrary, it was part of his spiritual cleanse, a rejection of materialism that would ironically lead him to become one of the wealthiest men in history. He grew fascinated with Eastern philosophy, diving headfirst into books about Zen Buddhism and taking long silent walks while reflecting on the nature of existence. The Steve Jobs we know, obsessive, minimalist, deeply intuitive, was forged in these early years, long before the Apple logo ever glowed on a MacBook. But it didn't stop with books. At 19, Steve saved up and flew to India in search of enlightenment. What he found instead was dysentery, disappointment, and a kind of revelation he never expected. India didn't give him all the answers. It gave him better questions. He returned with a shaved head, wearing traditional Indian robes, and even more convinced that clarity of mind would be his greatest tool. Steve experimented with psychedelics like LSD, which he later called one of the 2 or 3 most important things he ever did. He believed these experiences broke the rigid ways of thinking that limit creativity. They didn't make him high, they made him see. He also followed extreme diets, at times eating only fruits or carrots for weeks. He believed this would purify his body and mind, but sometimes it just made him smell weird, causing coworkers to avoid him. Still, Steve wasn't trying to fit in. He was trying to transcend. Jobs didn't just learn Zen principles, he lived them. He applied simplicity to every product he ever designed. He focused not on more, but on less, but better. The calm, clean user interface of the iPhone, that seed was planted in an ashram. To the outside world, it might have looked like a hippie phase, but in truth, it was the spiritual skeleton of everything he built. The obsession with design, the relentless focus, the craving for beauty and silence in a noisy world. All of it stemmed from this quiet rebellion. Steve Jobs didn't become a tech messiah by accident. He meditated on it. Chapter 3. The Birth of a Garage Empire. In 1976, in a modest garage in Los Altos, California, something extraordinary was about to happen. Steve Jobs was 21. Steve Wozniak, the shy engineering wizard, was 26. Together, they weren't just building a computer, they were building a belief. Wozniak handled the circuitry, the logic, the soul of the machine. Jobs handled the vision, the persuasion, the packaging. It was raw, messy, unorthodox. But the goal was clear, to bring computing power to everyday people. Their first creation was the Apple I. No casing, just a motherboard. It wasn't beautiful yet, but it worked, and it sparked interest. Jobs sold his Volkswagen van. Wozniak sold his HP calculator. They used the money to fund their first batch. Then came their first real order, 50 computers from a local computer store called Byte Shop. That moment flipped the switch. Apple Computer was born. The garage wasn't glamorous. It was hot, noisy, full of clutter and dreams. Boxes of parts, hand-assembled boards. Steve's adoptive father helped with the logistics. Every friend and neighbor was roped in to help. It wasn't a company yet. It was a movement with soldering irons. But even in these early days, Jobs was obsessed with presentation. He pushed for clean lines, smooth finishes, and intuitive design. "People do judge a book by its cover," he said, "and we may only get one chance to impress them." This attention to detail would later define everything Apple touched. More importantly, Jobs began showing his ruthless side. He took credit where credit wasn't always due. He pushed people hard, sometimes too hard, but his energy was nuclear, contagious. He didn't want to make a product. He wanted to make a dent in the universe. Their break came with the Apple II, a polished, mass-produced version of Wozniak's design. It launched at the West Coast Computer Fair and stunned the world. Color graphics, sleek casing, a computer that looked like it belonged in your home. Not a toy, not a science project, a tool for the future. Sales exploded. Investors arrived. By the time Apple went public in 1980, it was valued at over $1 billion. Steve Jobs, once sleeping on floors, now owned a palace of potential. But the storm was only beginning. Chapter 4: Rise, War, and Exile. By 1980, Apple was flying. The Apple II was a household name, bringing computers into homes and schools. Apple had gone public, and Steve Jobs, barely 25, was now a millionaire. But he didn't want money. He wanted revolution. And he knew the Apple II wouldn't be enough to get there. Jobs set his eyes on a secret project already brewing inside Apple. A next-generation computer with a graphical interface and a mouse. Technology inspired by a visit to Xerox PARC. It was called Lisa, but Lisa became mired in corporate politics and delays. Steve was kicked off the team he created, so he started another. The Macintosh team was his rebellion, his creative rebellion. They worked in isolation, like a pirate crew inside a navy. Jobs pushed them with brutal passion. Long hours, high expectations, emotional explosions, but also vision. The Mac would be sleek, beautiful, friendly, and personal. "Real artists ship," he said. And they did. In 1984, Apple launched the Macintosh with a legendary Super Bowl ad, directed by Ridley Scott, that portrayed Apple as the rebel against a gray, Orwellian future. It became one of the most iconic ads in history. The Mac was unveiled to a standing ovation. Steve was glowing, but the glow didn't last. The Mac was beautiful, but underpowered. Sales lagged. Internally, Jobs clashed with Apple's new CEO, John Sculley, the man he had personally recruited. Sculley, once enchanted by Jobs, now saw him as reckless, immature, even dangerous. Jobs was brilliant, but impossible. In 1985, it all imploded. Apple's board took sides, and not with Steve. He was stripped of responsibilities, pushed to the edges. Eventually, he was told to leave the company he co-founded. Steve Jobs, out of Apple. It was a public humiliation. He was just 30, but this wasn't the end. It was the beginning of something else. Chapter 5: Phoenix Mode. Next in Pixar. Steve Jobs was out, but he wasn't done. After leaving Apple in 1985, he had two options: disappear into wealth and comfort, or start over and prove everyone wrong. You can already guess what he chose. Jobs founded a new company. Next. The vision? Build an insanely powerful computer for higher education and research, something the world had never seen. The design was sleek, black, cube-shaped, a monument to aesthetic obsession. But inside, Next was a storm. Steve micromanaged everything, from the motherboard layout to the sound the disk drive made. The machine cost thousands. Too expensive, too niche. Next computers didn't sell well. But that wasn't the point. It was never about selling. It was about proving he was still Steve Jobs. But while Next floundered in the market, another of Steve's projects quietly exploded. In 1986, he bought a small, struggling animation studio from Lucasfilm for $10 million. It was called Pixar. They started off making commercials and short films, all while building something revolutionary: fully computer-animated movies. The world wasn't ready, but Jobs was. He pumped money into the company for nearly a decade, almost going bankrupt several times. Then, in 1995, Toy Story happened. It was the world's first full-length computer-animated film, a miracle of storytelling, humor, and technology. Pixar went supernova overnight. Steve Jobs suddenly owned the hottest studio in Hollywood. In one stroke, he became not just a tech visionary, but a titan of entertainment. Next may have stumbled, but it gave Steve something else, something bigger. Its software, its operating system, and its vision would soon become Apple's salvation. But that is the next chapter. Steve Jobs, out of Apple. It was a public humiliation. He was just 30, but this wasn't the end. It was the beginning of something else. Bonus 2. Reality distortion field. There was something about Steve Jobs that bent the world to his will, a trait so powerful, his colleagues gave it a name, the reality distortion field. It started in the early Apple days. Engineers would tell Steve that something was impossible. His response? He would stare at them in silence, challenge their beliefs, and insist it could be done. And then, more often than not, it was. Jobs didn't believe in limitations. He believed in pressure, in pushing people past the boundaries they had unknowingly built around themselves. He could make you feel like you were part of something bigger than life, something sacred, something you couldn't walk away from, even if you wanted to. But the reality distortion field wasn't magic. It was a mix of charisma, intensity, unshakable belief, and yes, manipulation. Steve could charm you into thinking the impossible was easy, or guilt you into working around the clock to meet a deadline he just made up on the spot. His presence was heavy, like gravity in human form. To some, this made him unbearable. To others, unforgettable. He could rewrite facts, timelines, even emotions. He didn't just pitch ideas, he rewired reality. Steve once convinced his team to shrink the Macintosh's size by simply refusing to believe it couldn't be done. When told a project would take months, he'd insist on 2 weeks. His belief alone had weight. It wasn't always ethical. He sometimes took credit where he shouldn't. He pushed people to the edge and rarely thanked them after. But the paradox was this: he got results. What others called manipulation, Steve called vision. The reality distortion field wasn't just about getting things done. It was about creating belief in something that didn't exist yet. A better future, a cleaner product, a world reshaped by imagination. And while it burned out many, it also built things the world had never seen before. Chapter 6. The Comeback King. Back to Apple. It was 1996, and Apple was dying. Once the gold standard of innovation, the company was now a sinking ship, bleeding money, releasing clunky products, and losing its identity. Morale was low. Investors were panicking. The world had moved on. But behind the chaos, something strange happened. Apple needed a better operating system. Desperately. And guess who had built one? That's right, Next. The very company Jobs had poured his soul into was now the last hope for the company that had kicked him out. And so Apple bought Next, which meant Steve Jobs was coming home. It wasn't an explosion, it was a whisper. He returned as an advisor. No title, no control, but slowly, he started rearranging things. Quietly, strategically, like a chess master flipping the board while smiling. Within months, the CEO was gone, and Steve was in. He was different now, more calculated, still intense, but wiser. He brought in trusted lieutenants. He slashed dozens of product lines, simplified everything, and focused the company around a single question. What does this really do for people? And then came the iMac. In 1998, Apple released a computer unlike any before. It was colorful, transparent, friendly. It looked like a spaceship crossed with a candy machine. People loved it. Sales soared. Apple was back in the headlines, not as a cautionary tale, but as a comeback story. Jobs began reshaping Apple's DNA. Fewer meetings, tighter teams, extreme focus. The chaos was being replaced by clarity. Slowly, a new Apple was rising. One that wasn't just about computers, but about changing lives through design and simplicity. He wasn't just back, he was winning, and he was just getting started. Chapter 7. The World in Your Pocket. The year was 2001. Apple had made its comeback, but Steve Jobs wasn't satisfied. He wasn't here to save a company. He was here to rewrite the future, and he was about to do it through music. At the time, digital music was a mess. Illegal downloads, buggy MP3 players, and a wild west of file formats. But Jobs saw the chaos as an opportunity. He gathered his team and asked one question. What if you could carry 1,000 songs in your pocket? It sounded impossible, but impossible was just the beginning. That year, Apple released the iPod, a sleek, white device that looked like it belonged on a spaceship. It didn't just play music, it made you feel cool. The wheel, the click, the earbuds. It was a statement, a lifestyle, a cultural shift. Suddenly, Apple wasn't just a tech company. It was part of your identity. But Steve was just warming up. In 2007, he walked onto the stage in his signature black turtleneck and jeans, took a deep breath, and dropped 3 words that would echo through history: an iPod, a phone, and an internet communicator. The audience clapped politely. They didn't get it yet. He repeated it, then smiled. These are not 3 separate devices. This is one device. The iPhone was born. A touchscreen, no buttons, apps, a mobile web browser that didn't feel like a punishment. It was the future, and it fit in your hand. Overnight, the rules changed. Entire industries collapsed. Others were born. The iPhone wasn't just a gadget. It was a new operating system for modern life. And behind it all was a man who saw simplicity as the ultimate sophistication. Tech wasn't about specs anymore. It was about how it made you feel, and no one understood that better than Steve Jobs. This was no longer a comeback. This was domination. Chapter 8, One More Thing. By 2010, Steve Jobs had become something larger than life. He wasn't just a CEO, he was a legend, a storyteller, a curator of the future. But behind the spotlight, his body was fading. He had been battling cancer for years. Publicly, he wore the same smile, the same uniform, the same force of vision. Privately, he was shrinking, quietly stepping back, letting others speak more on stage, delegating, preparing. But even as his health declined, his obsession with detail never did. He personally approved the design of the Apple Park campus, circular, futuristic, like something out of another world. He reviewed prototypes. He gave feedback from a hospital bed. He planned products for a future he would never see. In his final keynote, he was thin, fragile, but electric. His voice still carried the fire. The vision was still intact. And then, he stepped away. In 2011, he resigned as CEO. And just weeks later, the world woke up to the news. Steve Jobs was gone. The man who redefined how we listen to music, how we communicate, how we interact with the digital world, was now just a memory. Or was he? Because the fingerprints of Steve Jobs are everywhere. In your pocket, on your desk, in your routines. He didn't just sell devices, he designed ways of living. Minimalism, focus, emotion, harmony between art and engineering. Apple didn't invent smartphones, or tablets, or laptops, but Steve Jobs made them feel like magic. And even now, every time a screen lights up, every time a clean interface invites you to create, to connect, to dream. That spark, that's him. He once said, "We're here to put a dent in the universe." And oh, he did. Not with noise, but with elegance, with vision, with silence. One final click, one more thing, and fade to black.